It's time to finish this
beast.
Hey there, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. In this video, I'll show you some of the techniques I used to achieve the results you see here. If you're new to the channel and you're interested in seeing the complete build, I'll put a link in the upper right hand corner and you can go check that out after this video. Alright, let's get things rolling. Okay, first things first, let's go over some of the products I used to weather this vehicle.
Oh, behave. Yeah. Yeah, baby. Yeah.
The first thing we'll go over is how I achieve these dirt, fuel, and oil stains. I always start with the lightest tone and work my way up to darker tones. At this point, it's just thinned oil paint or enamel paint with just a slight hint of color in it. And the color I used here was the MiG 502 oil paint, Industrial Earth. I added my light streaking effects off camera, and now you can see I'm slowly building up the darker tones so I get a nice transition between the light and the dark areas. The next step is to add a rusty tone to that streak, and I'll either add a darker or a lighter streak depending on where it's coming from and the effect I'm trying to achieve. To blend the streaks, I'll use a slightly moistened brush, remove most of the thinner on a paper towel till it's almost dry, and then on both sides of that streak I'll kind of stump it or blend out each edge until I get a nice smooth streak. I don't really have a system, I just kind of jump all over the place depending on what I'm working on. I might add an oil streak here and a fuel stain there, and then add some more streaking effects. I like to see my effects evolve all at the same time, so I kind of get an idea in the end what it'll look like. I suppose I should mention that my mix of pigments and paint is already on the vehicle. So what I do is mix up the pigments and a little bit of paint, either oil, acrylic, or enamel, depending on what I'm going for, and then I'll blend it out with a Q-tip. What this does is create a dusty type finish on the top of the vehicle or the sides, and when you add your oil streaks or oil stains or fuel stains, they absorb some of that pigment and can give you some very realistic staining. I'll often continue that fuel stain down the side of the vehicle or wherever it is that it's spilling from, and I'll sometimes leave a hard edge or a soft edge depending on the effect I'm looking to achieve. To keep your streaks from having a hard edge, make sure you add thinner on both sides of your oil spill or stain, and that way it gives the paint the chance to blend into the rest of the surface without leaving a hard edge. Q-tips are a handy tool that you can use to help blend some of the staining or absorb some of the paint out of the pigment, and it just kind of helps the transition work a little better in a lot of cases. Most of you know by now, but for those that don't, I like my layering, and I do a ton of it. And as you can see here, I'm adding a lot of layered effects over top of each other. Nothing is more interesting, in my opinion, than seeing a model that has a lot of layers applied to it. It's very time consuming and sometimes very frustrating, but in the end I think it's well worth the effort. Once I'm happy with the first couple layers and they're dry, I go back in with a very dark brownish black color and just redefine some of those areas, not hitting them all, but giving them a little more interest in certain and specific areas of the vehicle. Because of all the layering involved, sometimes certain details will get lost and need redefining. So that's what I'm doing here, just redefining where the rust areas are on these fuel tanks. One method of speeding things along, especially with oils, is to use a hairdryer, and I find myself using that quite a bit, especially with oils and enamels since they take so long to dry. A hairdryer really helps to make your life easier. Of course, unless you melt the parts.
Say no more, know what I mean? Nudge, nudge.
Yep, I think some of you know what I'm talking about. Once the dark areas are complete, I'll go in with a lighter shade and pick up some of the highlights along the edges. Make sure you watch all the way through to the end if you want to see how I created the base for this model as well. I'll also link another video in the upper right hand corner if you want to go check that out. It's all about creating groundwork and dioramas. And of course, what's a fuel tank without some fuel spills? Now the key here is to stay random and asymmetrical. Try to keep things from looking boring and dull by giving the same effect over the whole vehicle or on the same items of equipment. It's always better to be random, and you'll always have a more interesting model that way, in my opinion. Here I'm using the Gamblin Asphaltium color again. It's such a versatile color and it can be used for so many different things in armor modeling and really any kind of modeling. But it really shines through when you're doing oil spills and fuel spills, in my opinion. I really like the final look I get. It has that sort of orangey blackish tone that fuel tends to leave after it's dried out. I also like to add some rusty tones to my oil spills and fuel spills. I find that gives them a little more realism as well and just boosts the color up a little bit and makes things look a little more interesting. Here I'm applying that paint pigment mixture that I've been talking about. Think of it as a sponge, so to speak, where all the paint that goes over the surface of it gets absorbed and can create a lot of really cool and interesting effects, such as distressed paint and fuel stains, of course. Once the first layer of staining is done, I go back over top of it with the pigment paint mix, dry that out, and then add another layer on top. I continue this process until I'm happy with the results. Here I'm applying the paint pigment mix to the side of the turret. This is what will help give a rain-streaked or water-streaked look to the sides of the turret, and also helps create a nice dusty appearance. In most cases, I'll prepare the surface first with a clean layer of paint thinner. This just helps things flow better over the surface and controls unwanted tide marks. The next step is to add some dark streaks to the surface, and I do this by adding the industrial earth color. Again, it's a very versatile color. I like to use it a lot when I'm weathering. It just seems to fit in with most applications on most models, in my opinion. Once that's dry, I'll go in with some mid-tone dark streaks. I'll add these in and around hatches or rivets or protrusions that dirt or grime might accumulate in. Next up, I like to add some rust streaks, and these are obviously going to be drawn down from areas where paint may have deteriorated underneath certain objects or around certain things like hatches, or areas where the crew may have worn the paint down to bare metal. I always blend the rust streaks on both sides, not necessarily touching the very center of the rust streak. Gently blend down each side of the rust streak and continue until you find you have a nice feathered transition. I like to add a variety of hard edge streaking with some soft edge streaking. I feel it makes things look more interesting and reduces the chance of things getting too symmetrical. Here I've added a layer of the paint pigment mix to the top of the turret. I just let that dry out a bit and then blend it into the top of the surface with a Q-tip. By adding the paint pigment mix to the top of the turret, that knocks things back a little bit and makes things look a little bland. So I decided to add a pin wash around most of the details again, just to re-establish some of those dark tones. Around the deepest areas of shadow, I'll add almost a black tone. This just helps to bring things forward and creates more depth. I'll also add some stains as well. One of the most fun and rewarding parts about the painting process for me is paint distressing. You can get a lot of interesting effects using different colors and different marks over the top surface of the vehicle where crew members might have walked or things got scuffed and scratched. I find I can be a lot looser with this process and be a little more creative with the application of paint. I'll also use a Q-tip with just a trace of thinner on it to pick up some of the areas that I want to blend in to the surface just a little more. Here you'll notice how the paint pigment mix really acts like a sponge and absorbs some of that excess pooling wash. That's truly the advantage of using this technique, in my opinion. You may have noticed when looking at heavy-duty equipment or engine parts how dust and dirt will attract grease. That's the effect I'm trying to emulate here. By adding a very dark tone around the area that I feel would carry that grease, in combination with the paint pigment mix, creates a very realistic looking grease tone where the pigment has absorbed a lot of that moisture, which is what happens on a real vehicle. Another layer of the paint pigment mix is now added and blended into the surface. And a layer of even heavier staining is applied at this point. And with a soft brush, I'll go in and blend those areas out again just to give things a little more of a natural look. And then another layer of staining. Here I'm adding scuff marks, implying where the crew may have walked. And I'm applying this with very little paint on the brush in a random poking motion, which will leave harder edges to those marks.
Nice.
Here I'm mixing up the color for the gun shroud, and from what I could tell, it looks like it's some form of a grayish green color, so I mixed up a little field gray and Iraqi sand to come up with this color. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. There's no rocket science here. The only thing I'd say is keep your acrylics as thin as possible and build them up in multiple coats. This is the best way to avoid any brush marks. Here I'm creating the shadow color for the gun shroud, and 1 drop of German Camo Black Brown into the original color and a little bit of water will be just right. I've thinned out the paint quite a bit here for the shadow. It's more of a glaze, so probably about 70% water to 30% paint. I build these up in multiple layers until I come up with the proper opacity. And once again, I'm adding the paint pigment mix here. This will give the tarp a nice dusty appearance over the highlighted areas. And you'll see once I remove all this later and it dries up how that effect looks. And one of the final steps I'll be adding here will be some bare steel effects on the weld marks. Since weld marks don't really rust, those that get chipped and exposed will be left with a steel finish. And for that final extra bit of punch on the steel areas, I like to use a graphite pencil. This just gives a realistic sheen to some of the edges that are exposed down to bare metal. I'll also polish certain areas with this silicone tip brush as well. And there you have it, the finished Egyptian T-34 122 model. I think I'm pretty happy with the overall result. I know I pushed myself and discovered a lot of new things in this weathering process, and I hope you enjoyed the journey as well. Don't retreat yet, because I have a bonus section here coming up on how I built the base for this model. Stay tuned, it's coming up right now.
Yes! That's awesome! Yes!
The base layer consists of a little bit of plaster, some sand, white glue, and some pigments. Once the base is completely covered, I'll set this aside to dry for a couple hours before I start the next step. Alright, now that the base layer is dry, I can put the top coat on. The base layer is there just to provide a non-absorbent area for the top layer to go on. If I was to put this right over top of the bare wood, it could possibly not adhere. So it's basically there as a protective element. So at this point the base has had about an hour to dry, just enough to get the surface a little hard. So I put a little water over top and just smooth everything out with my finger so I can get rid of the trowel marks I made with the stick. Then with a dampened paper towel, I'll texture the rest of the base. Once the first layer is about 80% dry, I'll add a very wet layer of the same material with about 70 to 80% crackle paste added this time. I added some baby powder to the bottom of the tracks and impressed it into the partially dry base. And I wanted to get a pretty good positive fit, so it takes a couple times to get it right. Then once I'm happy with the placement, I set it aside to dry. And this is the result after drying overnight. Here's some of the many experiments I did just trying to figure out how to make this crackle medium look like a desert wadi. And as you can see here, this is the best example. As you can see, the consistency and texture of the crackle paste is that of whipped cream. And it kind of looks like I'm making a spice cake here or something, but well, I wouldn't eat it and I wouldn't suggest anyone else to. Anyway, I just continued to mix this concoction together until I got a nice smooth even color and had something that looked close enough to the desert base color that I was looking for. At this point, I wasn't sure exactly how this was going to turn out. I was hoping it would turn out like my sample, but with crackle paste or mediums, you never really know what you're going to get. So I was a little nervous, but I've had enough experience with crackle mediums and paste that I kind of know what's going to happen in the end. And again, it depends on how thick you put it on or how thin you put it on will determine the final size of the cracks in the work. And after about 20 minutes dry time, I went back in again with some water just to smooth things out a bit. Then once the final placement of the vehicle was established, I patted everything down with a damp paper towel again and just kept working it till I found I got a nice texture over the whole base, hoping that in the end this would all crack up and look really nice. And the results were fantastic. I was very, very pleased with the outcome of this, and I really think I achieved the look of a desert wadi. The next step was to remove the material that the tracks sat in. So I used a spare set of track links here and just measured out everything and cut a groove. And then once that groove was cut out, I went in with another tool and scraped everything away. Once all that excess material was scraped up, I set it aside in another container for use as rubble later on. I did notice that while I was scraping out the areas for the tracks that the material was very fragile. So I decided to add a layer of white glue water mix, which solidified everything in place and stopped things from falling apart. Once the glue had dried, I noticed that it had left a slight sheen to everything. So I took the golden matte varnish and put that all over the base, and that took care of the gloss and made everything flat again. Next, I added a wash of industrial earth. This just helps to accentuate all the cracks in the groundwork and give things a little more depth and realism as well. Then I remove the excess with a clean paper towel. The next step was to use 5-minute epoxy to glue my homemade placards for the base, the nameplate here, and I made a hand-painted metal sign flag. I really feel that the base is just as important as the model that sits on it. I also epoxied the model to the base. A wash of industrial earth was then given to all the rubble that had been broken up on the sides of the tracks. A 50-50 mix of Iraqi sand and buff was used to pick out the details in the groundwork and broken earth around the tracks. Here I'm using the pigment paint mixture again, just to get a dusty look over top of all the excess broken earth and around the tracks, and this will help blend everything into the groundwork. And with that, I think we're finally done.
Hey, this video is approved. So consider subscribing, hit the bell notification, leave a comment, and share this video with someone in this great modeling community. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye now.